Hello everyone, my name is Janine Rose. This presentation will describe the way in which I use stories to enhance teaching in my first year composition course. This presentation is organized as follows. I will start by sharing motivations related to this research. Then I will share insights on the literature related to the use of stories in teaching. I'll then share some examples of stories used in my teaching, and I will conclude with final reflections on the value of stories in writing pedagogy. More specifically, the presentation highlights the way in which stories were used to increase engagement with writing-related concepts, personalize teaching content, and make the course seem more practical, and increase accessibility of course concepts for students. This work is informed by knowledge that I obtained from a midterm learning survey that I administered to my students. Specifically, the survey asked students about teaching strategies that they felt helped them with the course content in our first year composition course. Sharing personal stories related to the course content was identified as one of the top 3 teaching strategies that my students recommended that I continue in the course. This information brought me back to moments when I shared these stories in my classroom. I noticed that my students were in awe, amused, or surprised by the stories that I shared. More importantly, the stories stimulated greater engagement among students and very insightful comments and questions. As such, this presentation will highlight the stories that I use to give context for topics that I teach in my first year composition course. Gabriel Matnet offers a practical framework for the way in which stories can be used in teaching. I will highlight a few elements of this framework in this presentation and show how they apply to my teaching. Matnet suggests that stories can be offered as case studies or specific instances that have a fixed solution and are meant to teach certain principles or concepts. Stories can also be used to share historical elements in a particular field, share biographical information about a particular field or a particular figure. Additionally, stories can be used as anecdotal interludes, meaning that you can share stories about current events, recent research, or your experience as they relate to the course content. Stories can also be used as a foundation of an entire course in which weekly topics focus on the stories of specific characters or events from that story. My use of stories in my first year composition course falls into the first and third categories named by Matnet on the previous slide. Namely, I use stories as case studies to teach specific principles or concepts, and many of these stories are based on my own personal experience and research and would therefore be classified as anecdotal interludes. I share more information about the way in which I use these stories on the subsequent slides. The first story that I will talk about is related to academic integrity. I use stories to teach my students about the nuances of academic integrity at the university level. Students are often unaware of the different circumstances that may constitute an academic offense for various professors. The story I am about to share shows a type of academic offense that may not be well understood by first-year university students. This story shows how a story can be used to facilitate understanding and knowledge retention through surprise and awe about memorable circumstances. Most notably, I told my students about a plagiarism case where a graduate student was charged with a plagiarism offense. The student had recently migrated from Pakistan and had very little knowledge of referencing styles because this was not heavily taught or practiced at the institutions that she attended in her home country. The student made an effort to learn and use a citation style but did not use it perfectly throughout all of her assignments. The instructor who graded these assignments charged her with plagiarism, not because she did not cite at all, but because she had cited inconsistently throughout her assignment. She was expelled from the university and barred from enrolling at other academic institutions in Canada for 6 years. This story helps students remember the nuances of academic integrity for numerous reasons, namely the severity of the penalty, that was expulsion, in relation to the nature of the offense, which was inconsistent citation, and the student's immigrant status. She was a new Pakistani immigrant. Now, it's important to note that there is a very large contingent of students at my institution who either migrated from the same country, Pakistan, as a student who was charged with the academic offense, or could identify with the challenges of migrating to a new place or settling into a new institution. So this story was memorable for them for those reasons. And students are often surprised, and I often get a lot of questions about correct citations and the nuances of academic integrity because of this story. I also use stories to teach my students about rhetorical appeals in an accessible way. Specifically, I discuss how the ethos, namely the use of credibility to persuade an audience, and logos, the use of evidence and rationality to appeal to an audience, can intersect in complicated ways. Recently, I referred to a story where I made reference to an Instagram post by a well-known influencer who promotes cancer prevention habits and lifestyles amongst his followers. In this recent Instagram post, the influencer shared some research that argued that monk fruit sweetener that contained erythritol contributed to the development of cancerous tumors. However, the research that he shared was a very recent study that only involved 5 research participants. There are several things to note about responses to this post. Readers who were less versed in rhetoric and did not read the post with a critical and evidence-based lens trusted that the influencer presented information that was based on credible and trustworthy research. As such, many of these critical followers decided to eliminate monk fruit sweetener from their diets. In contrast, there were some individuals who clicked the link to the study and found that the research was not reliable because of the size of the research sample, and questioned the influencer's credibility and the soundness of the messages that he promoted in this Instagram post. Some of these followers decided to unfollow the influencer. The post showed my students that ethos could be influenced by notoriety, but strong ethos is not always associated with sound reasoning, especially in the social media landscape. My students were naturally intrigued by this story because of their heavy involvement in social media, particularly Instagram, and how much weight is placed on the words of influencers who have a high number of followers. Finally, I used a personal story to help students understand the perimeters and the nature of their first major writing assignment. Specifically, the first assignment asked students to think and write about their current attitudes to writing and the way that past and present experiences have contributed to their writing perspectives. To help students understand the level of personal information that can be included in this essay, I shared the challenges that I had with learning to write in standard English in my home country, Jamaica. Specifically, learning to write in a grammatically correct way was challenging because patois, or local dialect and language in Jamaica, often interfered with my ability to master writing in the English language. I was often chastised by my teachers for the mistakes that I made, and this reduced my love for writing. I also emphasize that this experience is connected to one of the threshold concepts in the course, namely that writing is influenced by prior experiences and identities. Students become more engaged with the possibilities for this assignment, and they are able to obtain a greater understanding of how to describe their writing experiences in the essay. Here are a few concluding points. Stories can be very effective in helping students to increase knowledge retention. The survey actually helped me to identify that because that wasn't at the forefront of my thinking when I shared these stories. The aforementioned stories show how I have used case studies and personal anecdotes to make difficult concepts more accessible. The stories also demonstrate the importance of stories for helping students understand the parameters of assignments. The opportunity to write and speak about these stories has provided me with a chance to be more intentional with my use of stories in the classroom. Students are also more likely to remember these stories because they have a greater impact on students than sharing course content in a traditionally didactic way.